Dmitry Medvedenko joins us now live from Istanbul. So, Dmitry, I'm hearing the talks are now over. Any sign that they were making progress?
Well, you know, it's been a whole mixed bag of messages coming out of these talks. The previous day when nothing happened, today when we've had at least 2 hours of conversation between the two sides. Now, what we know is the Russian and the Ukrainian delegations were in the same room for around 2 hours. This is already a major step forward because this hasn't happened in more than 3 years. Now, both of these sides are now preparing press releases on the results of the talks. But it's interesting to see what messages have been coming out. Different media citing sources because this meeting was, of course, held behind closed doors. Russian media at the end, when other media were saying that the talks are over, the Russian media were saying the Russian delegation took a pause and just left the room temporarily. This is nothing, of course, but at the same time, it might indicate that something major happened at the very end of these talks, which just caused them to end. The fact that they spoke for 2 hours is already quite important. A source in the Ukrainian delegation, quoted by Reuters news agency, is saying that the Russian delegation has put forward unrealistic demands, specifically citing the Russian demand for Ukraine to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. Now, this most likely implies that the Russian delegation, if this is true, demanded that Ukraine pull out all of its army, all of its forces from the 4 regions that Russia annexed in 2022, in September, October. Now, this could be the beginning of bargaining, where then Russia compromises and says, okay, fine, let's end it at the separation line, because Russia does not control any of those regions 100%. So we will have to, of course, wait for those press releases from 2 delegations to compare what they're saying. But a key difference is that the Ukrainian delegation has been openly demanding that these talks lead to a ceasefire, whereas the Russian envoy, Vladimir Medinsky, he is the aide to Vladimir Putin, the president was not here, of course, said that Russia is looking for long-term peace. Now, this word combination, I think, is important and is basically in juxtaposition to the demands of a 30-day ceasefire, which could seem like short-term for Russia.
All right, and thanks to Dmitry there for bringing us that update from Istanbul. Let's discuss these diplomatic talks in more detail with our guest. Vyacheslav Matuzov is a political analyst and former Russian diplomat. He joins us from Moscow. Peter Zalmayev is the executive director of Eurasia Democracy Initiative, and he joins us now from Kyiv. If I could start with Peter. So is Ukraine moving at a much faster pace than Russia when it comes to responding to the US push for peace talks?
Well, it seems like Vladimir Putin has simply ignored, Donald Trump's demand of a 30-day ceasefire. He basically spat in the face of the American president by essentially proposing these meaningless talks in Istanbul, which are a simple reiteration of what we saw 3 years ago. The Russians are back to the negotiating table. Putin refused to go. Instead, he sends this low-level nobody, Mr. Medinsky, an ex-minister of culture. So what are we supposed to make of it? It's a clear signal Putin does not want to negotiate on anything other than Ukraine's capitulation. That is what you just referred to in your report, your correspondent, when you talk about a longer-term kind of agreement that Russians are after. This is a kind of Orwellian doublespeak for essentially Ukraine's capitulation or cessation of Ukraine as a state able to control its foreign policy, able to decide on military alliances, and able to maintain a serious army, not just a kind of national guard of 50,000 that Putin foresees for Ukraine.
Okay, Vyacheslav Matuzov in Moscow. Is Moscow less enthusiastic about these talks, given, the issue of the ceasefire, that Moscow appears only interested in a temporary ceasefire at this point, the fact that we didn't see its president travel to Turkey as we saw from the Ukrainian side? How do you read that?
the goal of Russian delegation, as I understand, came to Turkey, come to Istanbul, not for reaching ceasefire. It is not the goal of Russian delegation. It's different from Ukrainian position. Ukrainian position is very much interested in achieving ceasefire immediately. It is critically important for Ukrainian side, that not for Russian side. And Russia came there to discuss the key problems. This Russian position was very plainly explained by Medinsky today in the morning in his press conference. He openly said what the goal of Russian Federation. It's reaching understanding on all important issue that interested the Russian Federation. It is stability and national interests of Russian Federation, and that's why I cannot see here any opportunity to close this gap between position of the Ukrainian and the Russian Federation. I think that the difficulties with negotiation will stay because approach to this negotiation absolutely different. Russian delegation waited for coming Ukrainians who were in Istanbul during 24 hours, even more, 63 hours. 36 hours.
Right.
And that's why I think that Russian position is clear. We are ready to discuss very important points for Russian security disturbances.
Okay, so that's a good point. If I may,
ready to discuss, we discuss. If not, no.
Okay. All right, let me jump in there because that's, I think, a good point to focus on now. Peter, the two sides in the end did end up talking for 2 hours. What were they talking about? And what was the starting point? Was it where things left off in 2022? Is that an acceptable starting point for the Ukrainian side? Do we know the answers to some of those questions?
Well, I suspect since 2022, Russia's demands have grown, and Russia has obviously been emboldened by Donald Trump's refusal to press them against the wall, so to speak, and demand some serious concessions from the Russians. It seems like the only concessions that are being asked of Ukrainians. And as Donald Trump said, the big concession is Russia is making is by promising not to invade the rest of Ukraine, where if it could, it would have done this a long time ago. 3 years and counting later, we're still there, and Russia is still very, very, very slowly making its progress in the Donbass. At this rate, it will take several decades
Peter, does that mean,
for its army to
should we
reach
understand
Kyiv.
from what you're saying, Peter, does that mean that Ukraine does not accept to start talks from things like it is not going to join NATO, that's a given. It will recognize Russian sovereignty over parts of Ukraine Russia claims. Some of those things that Donald Trump's administration seemed to signal was the starting point. Is that still being resisted by Ukraine?
Well, it's not necessarily being resisted on its own. You have to understand that there's a lot of positions that are not really being fully discussed. I mean, the one sticking point would be for Russia to, which is probably going to do, it's going to demand that Ukraine leave those parts of those occupied territories which are not occupied, Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, that are not occupied. That means Ukraine would have to withdraw from more of its territory. That's obviously not a non-starter for Ukraine. We understand that probably NATO membership is a non-starter, but in the absence of NATO, we are waiting to see what security guarantees are being provided. The rare earths and minerals treaty that we signed with the Americans. I mean, is that a worthy substitute to this to the membership of NATO? Probably not. So we are still waiting to see. And the Russian side is not agreeing, is not willing to agree to the presence of any foreign troops on the territory of Ukraine. So this is where we are at an impasse. That's why no progress is being made, because the position of both sides are still irreconcilable.
Vyacheslav, on that point, are the discussions from the Russian perspective really now about fine-tuning its move beyond the question of whether or not Ukraine joins NATO, whether or not Russia will fully pull out of all Ukrainian territory? Is it more along the lines of some finer details about what kind of security guarantees the West could give Ukraine that Russia would be comfortable with? And to what extent is that stuff going to be worked out directly between Putin and Donald Trump, not just in these sorts of direct talks between Russia and Ukraine?
Correct. I agree with this view, because Russia very plainly explained its position to all NATO states, all NATO organizations, including the United States and European countries, in December 21. And in this refusal to discuss the situation from this angle to Ukrainian situation ended with Russian military actions in February 22. That's the beginning point. And then I can say that Russia battered with its security situation in the western frontiers. And I don't consider that Russian position can be changed even, because we are very simply explained why we began these military actions. First of all, the second thing, it is about the four regions that are now considered to be Russian constitutionally, because in Russian constitution changes was made in 22, even or beginning 23, when they included Zaporozhye, Kherson, Lugansk, Donetsk to the Russian Federation. That's why Ukraine demand to return that regions back to the Ukrainian sovereignty. It is not acceptable for Russian, and I think
of course, it's not internationally recognized, though. Of course, Mr. Vyacheslav, the Russian
discussion this issue. Russian forces will be going ahead, and if they are considered that Russia very slowly moving to the west, I think this mistake can be changed during some period of time in the nearest future.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Let's thank both of our guests, Peter Zalmayev, the Executive Director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, and Vyacheslav Matuzov, political analyst and former Russian diplomat. Thank you both.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.